ouais. La main gauche. Il y a tiens. Avec l'amour qui gagne.
The old age of the wrinkled sea was a moan. And I knew that the floating head had drifted here. As the surf hissed, Omeros.
Hello, everyone. I'm Annie Paul, an occasional art writer and editor of the online platform of Writing from the Caribbean, PRE. Thank you for joining us for this last episode in the Global Conversation series hosted by the National Gallery of Jamaica. This one is titled The Legacy of Okwui Enwezor. Who was Okwui Enwezor? And what is his legacy? And why do we need to discuss it or dwell on it? These are some of the questions I hope will be answered by the end of this discussion. First, a brief introduction to the man. During the span of a mere quarter of a century, Nigerian curator Okwui Enwezor dealt the structural misogynism and racism of the art world a series of mortal blows. By rearranging its most paradigmatic institutions, Documenta 11 and the Venice Biennale, neither has ever been the same since. It was an insurgency long in the coming. The great white Euro-American art world lumbered into the 21st century virtually intact. But 20 years later, under the momentum gained by the Black Lives Matter movement, the Herculean work done by Enwezor and his collaborators, the cumulative efforts of the Black Arts movement in the UK, at the helm of which stood remarkable agonists such as Rashida Rain and our own Stuart Hall, and Thelma Golden and others in the United States, it is possible to see a shift manifesting itself in the increased visibility of non-white, non-Euro-American artists, curators, art historians, and players generally in the metropole and elsewhere. There is a long way to go yet, but a lot of ground has been gained. And a lot of this is due to the efforts of Okwui Enwezor. So joining me in this segment are Isaac Julien, Mark Nash, and in a pre-recorded segment, because she's all the way in Singapore, Ute Meta Bauer, whom I'll introduce separately in that segment, which, that segment will be played after a live conversation with Mark and Isaac. All three were close associates of Okwui Enwezor, and it is a privilege to have this conversation with them. Isaac Julien, who has St. Lucian parentage, emerged in the 1980s as a filmmaker and is now an internationally renowned film and video installation artist. He founded the Sankofa Film Collective in the 1980s in England and was instrumental in introducing Stuart Hall to the work of Black British artists, photographers, and filmmakers who were active at the time. Julian's multi-screen film installations and photographs incorporate different artistic disciplines to create a poetic and unique visual language that he sums up as the cinematization of art. His film installations and photographs have been shown at the Whitney Museum, Tate Liverpool and Tate Modern, Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, PS1 Center for Contemporary Art in New York, and many other globally prominent venues. Julien participated in the Venice Biennale at the inaugural Diaspora Pavilion at the 57th edition in 2017. And previously, he presented Capital and directed Das Kapital Oratorio in the 56th edition of the Venice Biennale, which was curated by Enwezor in 2015. Julien has taught extensively, holding posts such as Chair of Global Art at University of Arts London. And in 2018, he was made a Royal Academician. In 2017, Julien was awarded the title Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. Now, Mark Nash is a distinguished independent curator, film historian, and filmmaker with a specialization in contemporary fine art, moving image practices, avant-garde, and world cinema. He's currently a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he founded the Isaac Julien Lab with his partner and longtime collaborator, Isaac Julien. As a curator, Mark Nash has frequently collaborated with Isaac Julien on numerous film and art projects. He also collaborated regularly. He also collaborated regularly with the late Okwui Enwezor, notably on Documenta 11 and on the short Century, Independence and Liberation Movements in Africa. Very recently, Nash was part of a small team instrumental in bringing to life Enwezor's vision of an exhibition to make visible important work by African-American artists who were responding to key historical episodes and moments of racial violence in African-American history, post-1964. Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America opened at the New Museum in February this year and continues till early June 2021. Welcome, Isaac. Welcome, Mark. Let's talk. Is there any chance that the Grief and Grievance exhibition might be extended?
I don't think so. It would be great if it could, but I think the impression is that so much energy went into clearing the rights for the various works that it would make a big challenge to extend it. I mean, to extend it in other venues. Right. But I think the way Okwui was thinking about it, it's much more like a call, in a way, to call to action from curators and museum directors to say, well, this was done in New York, as it were remotely, because Okwui was working in Munich at the time with friends and collaborators in the New York art world, and a museum in Chicago or Los Angeles, or for that matter in Kingston, Jamaica, should be able to do their own version of the artist's response to the current pandemics, which in the States, we talk about the pandemic of racism, obviously, but also the virus pandemic, and so on. Great. There's a number of interlocking issues. And I think that's the best way to think of the exhibition, rather than try and tour it.
Right. And we're going to get into a deeper discussion of the exhibition later, but I wanted to start with Isaac. Isaac and Paradise Omeros, which you showed at Documenta 11's Platform 3 in 2001 in St. Lucia, in a small workshop that I was also privileged to be part of. Do you want to talk about that? Tell us more about how, it must have been wonderful to focus on something going back to your origin, your original place of origin, I should say.
Oh no, absolutely. And I think there's a way in which you could say that the whole kind of project that Okwui Enwezor initiated in Documenta 11 was to completely decenter Documenta away from the West, and indeed to try to focus attention on artists in the diaspora and to invite the actual global art world into that event. And he did that by, of course, having various platforms around the world, including India and the Caribbean. Of course, St. Lucia was, for him, I think, an acknowledgement really of the influence of the region in relationship to how it had actually interpolated his own practice. Mark and we first met him actually through his interest in our film on France Fanon, Black Skins, White Masks, which we made in the mid-90s. And he invited us after he came to visit us in Bloomsbury, and we gladly gave him all our archival photos,
right.
Which I think aided some of the research to his exhibition in Johannesburg Biennale a few years later, where he invited us to show the film France Fanon, Black Skins, White Mask. And so he was very struck by France Fanon's ideas, a Martinican, which in some senses he would revisit in the St. Lucia event, the Créolité platform, which you attended, Annie. I remember your fantastic paper that you gave, Sound Systems Against the Unsound System of Babylon. And
Yes.
And there was a way, I think, that he was very interested in really also hearing from its inhabitants. And this whole question around creolization and Créolité was something which was very much afloat at that particular moment, especially in the Francophone world, with people like Eduardo Glisson and Patrick Chamouset, had won the prize for, I think it was Texico. And there was a lot of interest and excitement also in the Anglophone speaking part of the Caribbean and diaspora in these questions. And so there we were all in St. Lucia, which is the island of my parents' birth, which I actually got my citizenship of recently.
That's amazing, yeah.
I'm proud to say. And there's a way in which I think in that platform, hearing your paper amongst all the other papers, it was incredible to meet someone like Derek Walcott, who I later on went on to collaborate to make the Paradise Omeros work. And so, of course, I was borrowing the Omeros title from Derek Walcott's Nobel Prize winning book, and trying to translate that into an artwork, into a free screen work as a meditation on the relationship between the Caribbean and Britain. And in that time, of course, I think the excitement around the Créolité Creole platform was really about trying to think about these important locations as spaces, both for the arts and for theory and for reflection on how those would make their interventions into the art world. And I think it took a number of years for that to actually take place. Of course, it's rather funny, of course, you remember, Annie, when we were there, and Mark, that we had the whole conversation with Derek Walcott, and Derek Walcott was, in a way, quite ambivalent, I think, about our conversations.
Yes, he was very dismissive of what he considered intellectual high talk, and which, I don't think that's what I do. But for him, the language of, the way in which it was presented to him made him a bit apprehensive, but I think he relaxed very quickly once he realized that we were all just regular folk, maybe, and that he didn't have anything to worry about. I remember him talking about the length of a breath. Do you remember when he was talking about his practice? But yeah, so that film, that Paradise Omeros, Roberta Smith described it as the most naturalistic and least baroque of your works. Do you think that's true? And would it have been that completely different setting of being in the Caribbean that contributed to that?
No, I think absolutely. And I think there's a way that it's really interesting in terms of its longevity, because it's a work which is going to be shown at Tate at the end of this year in an exhibition, which is called Oceans Apart, which looks at Caribbean artists in the UK and the contribution that they've made. I think it's an intergenerational show, and Paradise Omeros will be shown. So in a way, we could say this is a British response to the Creole platform that it took 20 years, but eventually its intervention is being made. But of course, that intervention started with Mark and his fellow curatorial team, along with Okwui, who was leading them, in a way of trying to make these really significant inroads into really making these paradigmatic shifts in the art world. And I think we can say that the Documenta Platform and its presence in St. Lucia was the beginning of really trying to unfold that as a sort of event that would continue on and in a way make many ramifications. And so, and I think that's really interesting in terms of thinking about Okwi's influence, you know, because of course he came to the Caribbean when he came with his team, with Mark and his fellow curatorial fellows to Cuba, and they kind of were in Havana in 2000, and you could, and that caused a complete shift, I think. And I think there's a way in which, you know, he's always been interested, or was always interested, in the Caribbean and its artists and theorists as well, because he greatly admired Stuart Hall. As you know, that Stuart Hall was, I think, one of the most important thinkers in terms of really causing a complete revolution in the cultural attention to the Black arts in the diaspora. And of course, it was really important to have someone like Stuart as well. And I think, in a way, his work created a theoretical cornerstone to the project. And Documenta's legacy, I think, is also strongly connected to a lot of Stuart Hall's ideas.
Right, absolutely. That's quite true. Mark, did you want to jump in here and say anything about your experience of being part of that curatorial team, for instance?
Oh yeah, well, there's lots of different things. And I think maybe before you move too far on, you should play Isaac's short film featuring Derek called Encore, which I think you have as part of that. But yes, I mean, this was a conference that I was more involved than many of the others, because through Isaac I already, and through Stuart Hall being a friend, we had a lot of the connections. So, I mean, there was a kind of sort of little international incident, shall I say, between the French speaking and the English speaking, in the way that I was given the mission of bringing both Derek Walcott and Edouard Glisson together to St. Lucia. And they both happened to be speaking in Berlin in two conferences, well, in a poetry conference. And I mean, I was quite brave, and I sort of went up and spoke to them both, and they both said this was great. However, Glisson was a little miffed that Walcott had gotten the Nobel Prize. So a lot of our conversation was that was to do with this. I won't go into the detail of it, but in the end, he said he couldn't come because of reasons of health. But I think it was also moving to this other territory, because at that point in Martinique, Glisson was planning a big museum, which is a slightly strange project given the notion of his notion of Créolité, but maybe it was going to be an alternate kind of museum. But I think what's productive, one of the productive things about Créolité and Creolization platform is that it was multilingual. You had people who were Hispanophone, Francophone, Anglophone, and you began to realize that what Glisson said about the Caribbean being an archipelago, a group of small islands, which in some ways have the potential to be more creative and can turn around and develop ideas faster than these big continental monoliths. It's like turning a small ship is much more mobile than a big oil tanker kind of thing. And I think we had definitely that,
Yes, and I remember there were the other big, you referred to the kind of mixture of people who were there, different linguistic groups, but there were also very strong disciplinary divisions. For example, you had a lot of serious linguists at that workshop, and I don't think they were very partial to the cultural theory kind of folks, right? I mean, there was also that tension there. And we were also somewhat indifferent to their very technical approach to Créolité and Creolization and Creoles. They were more interested in talking about language and Creoles as languages.
But then there was also the politics, the language politics, because what is it? The Governor General of St. Lucia.
Perlit Louisi,
Louisi, exactly. And she was part of a group in favor of Creole orthography, in favor of teaching Creole as a language. And then there were others who were really against that because, and who's to say which is right, but some people regard it as a language that's purely oral, and that writing it shouldn't substitute from being able to speak French or English or whatever. But anyway, that was, the linguistic side of it was quite controversial. But of course, one of the great things about the Documenta 11 platforms, all 4 of them and the 5th one, the exhibition, was they were supposed to generate controversy and come up with different approaches to political and cultural issues.
Yeah, I mean, it was really quite a revolutionary event, that Documenta.
Maybe this would be the moment I could briefly share my screen and just show your audience something of the different platforms.
Yes,
I'll do it briefly.
That's a good idea. Thanks.
Share. So one of the projects I've been working on together with Ute and some of my colleagues from that original exhibition is converting as materials into an internet form. So this is accessible to the public. You have a lot of the publications from Democracy Unrealized, Experiments with Truth, Under Siege, and Créolité and Creolization, where there are the essays by Okwui, Gerardo Mosquera, Annie's essay, and also Isaac's talking about creolizing vision. And if you look on the web for platform 6, you will find it. And the idea is that people will add to it. It's an open website. It's intended as a resource to build information about Okwi's exhibitions, but also for a place to do research and further work on all these important issues.
I think you saw a clip from a composite of the free screen of Paradise Omeros, which was how it was originally shown in Documenta. But I made this work called Paradise Encore, which was a single screen, which is for an actual public project. This work is an unlimited artwork. So in other words, it could be shown on the internet, anybody could have it. It's a short work, but it basically is a kind of utilizing extracts from Paradise Omeros in it, Derek Walcott recites, we see him, and also there's a rendition of his poem, which is sung as an aria by a young St. Lucian. And so it's kind of an assemblage, you could say, of the masterwork Paradise Omeros into a kind of, if you like, memento of the work, and if you like, the possibility of it being able to be available for a wide audience.
That's great. So I hope it's lined up. Can we see it?
Because this is the Atlantic now. This great design of the triangular trade. Achille saw the ghost of his father's face shoot up at the end of the line. Achille stared in pious horror at the bound canvas and could not look away or loosen its burial knots. Then, for the first time, he asked himself who he was. I saw how my shadow detached itself from them. When it disembarked on the wharf through a golden haze of corn from another coast. My throat scarred from a horizon that linked me to others. When our eyes lowered to the cobbles that climbed to the castle yard. When the coins of the olives showed us their sovereign's face. My shadow had preceded me. How else could it recognize that light to which it was attached? This port where Europe rose with its terrors and terraces, slope after slope.
Great. So Isaac, you said you wanted to talk about Okwui in London.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things around, you know, the many visits that Okwui made coming to London, one of his early visits was actually bringing him to Nottingham Gate Carnival. Oh. And I think this relationship to Carnival was something which he was incredibly interested in. And I think in a way, he achieved his interest in Carnival in the probably vocal aspect of it in an aesthetic sense when he, you know, directed Venice. And there's a way in which bringing Okwui to Nottingham Gate Carnival also spurred his interest in an earlier work which I made called Territories in 1984, which is ostensibly a film about Nottingham Gate Carnival. And it was a kind of also deconstruction of Nottingham Gate Carnival, because in the Sankofa Media Collective at that time, we were very critical of all the dominant documentaries which were made about, or conventional documentaries which were made about Carnival. And we wanted to make a work which was somehow, in a way, going to creolize the aesthetics of Carnival and the very making of the work.
Right,
and,
right.
And so I think this kind of early interest in Caribbean culture and in Black British culture's rearticulation of it was really set into trail a lot of his ideas around Documenta 11. So, and later on, he would actually show this work in the Paris Triennale that he directed, because he argued with me over a number of years that I should show this work in the exhibition context.
Okay, okay, great. So I just looked at the watch and we're running out of time. And I think people also want to hear about the Grief and Grievance exhibition. But there was another clip that did you want to show something from Territories?
Well, we could show a clip from Territories.
I think that would be good. And then Grief and Grievance, we can do it in the time, Annie.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just didn't realize so much time had passed. Okay, so please show the next video.
Maybe it should be the second clip of Territories, if possible, because I think that kind of question of the creolization of images and sounds from Carnival and sound systems really gets together.
Great. So you've got the if we have the second clip ready, can we play it?
Against us is the law with its immensity of strength and power. Against us is the law. Police know how to make a man a guilty or an innocent. Against us is the power of police.
It's lovely. I mean, not the riots, but the way it ends. Great.
When you get that kind of, the synergy really of the kinds of questions which would be, of course, questions which would haunt, our political stage currently. So, yeah.
Great.
And I think turns to grief and grievance in an interesting manner, because these questions around policing are very central to them.
Yes, absolutely. So, Mark, do you want to, are we going to show the PowerPoint?
Yeah, why don't I
or
run
introduce
through a
it first?
PowerPoint, and I'll introduce it first. I'll share my screen if I can. Yep. Right, that's great. And because there you've got a picture of Okwui in Venice. Yeah. But this exhibition, Grief and Grievance, was something he was working on for the last 2 or 3 years of his life in dialogue with the new museum, with Massimiliano Gioni. And I was brought in together with Glenn Ligon, New York-based artist, and Naomi Beckwith from the MCA Chicago, to form a curatorial team to help realize his vision. This is Adam Pendleton, Khalil Joseph. It's one of Okwi's most straightforwardly political exhibitions, I would say, focusing specifically on the Black Lives Matter moment, although it had started Black Lives Matter in 2013, Okwui was monitoring the work of artists from Munich. So he didn't, of course, live to see any of it installed. This is Nari Ward, one of Okwi's long-term collaborators, who was also in Documenta 11, in fact.
And who has Jamaican ancestry.
Indeed. And on each floor there was music. There was either Tishon Soni playing music or music being part of a particular artwork. So this was an exhibition that was full of different kinds of sound, which I think is also, this is one of the key works. Okwui chose a few small works by older generation artists, Jack Whitten, I believe, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Melvin Edwards, as a kind of jumping off point. And then there was a group of younger artists, such as here, which were new to Okwui. That is to say, he might have read about them but not seen them, and we had to sort of interpret his proposal. Darwood Bay's monumental series dealing with the bombing of the church in Birmingham was obviously something Okwui was very familiar with, and so there was a conversation, if you like, between younger and older curators, but focusing, as I say, specifically on Black America, or I should say the Black artists in the United States, really.
Wonderful. It looks like, I mean, it's very hard to get a sense of it from looking at images of it, but all the reviews were rave reviews.
I think we learned something from our Documenta 11 experience, which is that if you have the resources to have a curatorial team, you get a different quality of exhibition because people can share their ideas, they can collaborate, and that you can filter out too many kind of sort of curatorial enthusiasms, as it were. The Carrie Mae Weems, I mean, it's a difficult museum, difficult space in many ways, but I think Massimiliano Gioni did a very good job and we were all worried about there being too much work. But when you actually go in and experience the work, which is different from looking at it in a PowerPoint, it really held together. But as I say, there's the Basquiat.
That's a Basquiat?
Yeah, it's a very early Basquiat,
Unusual.
An encounter with the police and Kerry James Marshall in the background there.
Simone Lee.
Exactly.
Yes, I mean, I could add that, you know, I think one of the things that you get from the exhibition is, you know, artists such as, of course, Kerry James Marshall, who is such an important American artist, painter of his generation, and having his work resonate with other artists, you know, such as Glenn Ligon or Nari Ward or Simone Lee. There's a way in which I think it really creates this sort of aura of connection between the ways in which these artists have been concerned with questions of a particular nature, which in a way expresses the kind of political climate of American culture, but we've never seen them all together, you know. And I think it's this question of presenting the works all together, not as to announce the idea that, you know, these Black artists have all these things in common, just because they're Black, but I think there's a way in which it becomes such a profound, rigorous statement about the condition of America today. And I think, you know, it made the exhibition profoundly moving. For example, you know, I remember seeing the Festa Gates work, which you just saw there, in Venice, and kind of not really maybe paying that much attention to it, but somehow having it in the space next to Lorna Simpson, you know, in relationship to the blues, you really got this kind of incredible kind of sensation of the ways in which these artists have been signifying, in a way, the conditions.
One of the best reviews that I read of this exhibition was in the Washington Post. And I think the critic's name was Sebastian Smee. He talked about the cathartic potential of the exhibition. And I want to read this quote because it kind of sums up the nature of Okwi's intervention. It says, quote, "The most ambitious exhibitions help to usher in new ways of seeing. The Nigerian curator Okwui Enwezor, who died in March 2019 at just 55, specialized in these kinds of paradigm-shifting shows. His exhibitions had a prescient feeling. If you saw them or even read about them, you knew you were seeing the shape of future conversations about art." So, you know, in some ways, what you just said is that this exhibition, which was conceived, I think, in 2018 or earlier, but you can see what currency it has in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the steam that was gathered. Okwui was already thinking about this. He had wanted to have this exhibition launched during Trump's presidency, right? Right?
Yeah, no, he wanted it to be launched at the time of the election, thinking that somehow it could spur the Democratic side on. But in fact, it fitted equally well in the pandemic, post-Black Lives Matter movement period, because as you say, it is helping us think about what exhibitions inspired by or influenced by this could be, which is what I meant in the beginning about how it could be taken on board by other people in doing their own exhibitions, which might be quite different.
That's a very intriguing possibility. Yeah. But I mean, I like also this quote that I saw. It's something that he said about the crystallization of Black grief in the face of a politically orchestrated white grievance. And, you know, the exhibition, it seems to me, Grief and Grievance, was a kind of reliquary, you know, in the sense that what he did or what he envisaged was bringing together a number of works that had been relegated to the status of relics over time, you know, because they were made and shown, but they were no longer visible. And bringing them together like this, I think, has a particular potency and power that I heard people refer to in all these reviews. Yeah.
I mean, that's what curating is, in a way, taking works and then putting them into conversation, and then that conversation creates a new discourse. We were at one point, people said, why are there no white artists in this list? What about white grievance? And we said enough already. It's, you know, that's not the conversation that we need to have. There's been a lot of those white exhibitions. So Okwui was very clear that this was to be about Black American artists.
Yeah. Absolutely. Did you want to say something, Isaac?
No, I mean, he was very clear about that. And I think he really wanted to make an intervention. I think he saw exhibition making as a form of making political interventions into a culture where I think he thought that actually that in America had actually been slow to recognize the kind of value of Black artists working. And I think there's a way in which you're right that the intergenerational conversations between these artworks
that too.
resonate in such a kind of prophetic manner, you know, because there's works which are like, you know, from the 60s and 70s right up to, you know, our current moment. And I think it does do this sort of work of this question of, in a sense, mourning, which Mark writes about in his text, as do several other writers and contributors. And there's a way in which I think it becomes incredibly important that we had this exhibition at this time. And we managed to visit Okwui many times in Munich because of our location in London. And I think we were able to, in a way, create those conversations that he wanted.
That's wonderful. So I think we can return to this in the discussion section, and we should now play the video clip I did. It's not a clip, it's a video segment that I recorded with Ute. So I don't know, Session, if you have it lined up. Good morning, Ute. How are you? Well, I'm saying good morning, but it's late night for you there because you're all the way in Singapore, which is 13 hours ahead of Jamaica. But I hope you're awake and able to talk to me.
Yes, I'm kind of awake, but it's super hot here.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, let me start by introducing you to the audience. Ute Meta Bauer was a co-curator of Documenta 11 with the late Okwui Enwezor. In 2015, she co-curated a presentation of the work of the artist Joan Jonas for the US Pavilion at the 56th Venice Biennale. She is also founding director of the NTU Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore. Welcome, Ute. Welcome again, I should say. It's just so great to have you in my living room, courtesy of Zoom, and to be talking about Okwui Enwezor's legacy. We originally met at the Havana Biennale in the year 2000, when you were there as part of that Documenta 11 team. What was that like? And what was, well, before you tell us what working with Okwui was like, perhaps you could situate the historic nature of his selection as the artistic director of Documenta 11. That was a really huge shift, wasn't it?
Yeah, maybe I have to introduce a little bit Documenta. Documenta was founded in the aftermath of World War II in Germany, also to in Kassel, which was prior the center also of the German weapon industry. And it was also an attempt from Arnold Bode, a local curator and designer, his wish was to reconnect Germany after fascism, after fascist regime to the world of art. And it became, after one edition, first every 4 years, then every 5 years, one of the most important events in the world where new tendencies in art are introduced, and Documenta often created a paradigm shift. But Documenta always had been curated until then by a European curator. And only prior at Documenta 10, it was for the first time that a female curator, Katrin David, curated a Documenta. And when Okwui Enwezor was selected, it was the first time that it was an African curator. He was often coined as the first non-European curator, which made him furious. He said, "I'm not a non-European. I'm actually an African."
Yes,
And
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
but he said, we discussed this again shortly before his passing, when I told him that Ruang Grupa has been selected, an artist collective from Indonesia, as the next artistic director, as a group, as a collective artistic director. And he said, well, the times have changed. And he said, we were never a collective. We were actually individuals who worked together. And he said, but he will never forget the day he was selected in Berlin, and then they drove to Kassel to introduce him to the press, the directorship of Documenta. And he said it was like a bomb detonated when he entered that room and they saw a black person. They're introduced, and he said it was such a surreal feeling also for him. And of course he was very proud, but he said you cannot imagine how that feeling was.
No, it must have been enormous. Did he actually face much racism? And, what were the challenges for him as this outsider, quote unquote,
No, I think I think Germany was ready for that. And Kassel, actually, he was very beloved in Kassel. I mean, sure, not from every citizen of the very small city of 260,000 people. But when we went along the streets, and so everybody greeted Okwui and had a chat and said, hello, Mr. Enwezor. And so he felt very home there. He lived there, and also his wife and was partially there, and later his little daughter, Uchenna. And he always felt in Kassel very welcome. So I think it was more when we traveled, depending where we were, that we were confronted with racism. And of course, prior he was confronted with racism. And of course, if you are selected in Germany, in the city where Documenta happens, and you're the artistic director, of course you're welcome. It's a very important show for that city.
Right. And then after that meeting in Havana, I saw you again, probably a year later in St. Lucia at the Platform 3, was it, of Documenta 11, which was a workshop on Créolité and Creolization. I mean, that was an amazing closed workshop, which included people of the caliber of Stuart Hall and Derek Walcott, among many other illustrious people. What was that? Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it included also Gerardo Mosquera, who curated the 1984 Havana Biennale, South Biennale. That was really also paradigm shifting. And so it was a number of people from the Caribbean, but also from La Réunion, Françoise Vergès, who was our kind of like an advisor for this conference, because you find Creole languages basically throughout the African and Caribbean continent, basically, as Stuart Hall says, where you had slavery. he said for him, Créolité cannot be separated from the notion of slavery. And,
right.
and that was very crucial to understand. And for me, of course, it was also a first encounter with the discussion, not only on négritude, on métissage, but also Edouard Glissant's concept of the Créolité. And deliberately, they, Okwui and also Françoise and I would say the closer advisors like Sarat Maharaj and Stewart, and so they recommended to keep this workshop a closed workshop, so there can be an open discussion around this notion and not having press there. It's also important to note this was right in the aftermath of 9/11, and the conference took place. We stayed in a resort. St. Lucia is a small island. It's also actually the island where the family of Isaac Julien is from. His mother is from St. Lucia.
Right.
And it's also a small Caribbean island that shifted colonial powers, and it means its Creole language is also shifted. So it is a very interesting location, but it was also very important to do this, to have this conference in a country where Creole is a language that is spoken. And it was very interesting because the then head of state, a former school teacher, she was at this moment introducing Creole as a written language to St. Lucia, and they were working actually on a grammar. There was no written grammar prior. Mm-hmm. So all of this was very new to me, I have to say, and it was really interesting to see the political connotation that is part of Créolité. And so it was really, I mean, the German press would write, why they're going into a resort, like, I mean,
really, that was the criticism.
To go there, and then it's a closed workshop, you're excluded. Mm-hmm. But first of all, as I said, it was in the aftermath of 9/11 with a few others, if you might remember, there was nobody staying there. And St. Lucia, as I just want to mention, is a smaller island that has this history, but it was also a destination for cruise ships. So all of this was gone the moment we were there. There was no tourism left. In this moment in time, it was just, as I said, like it was a few months after 9/11, and global tourism was kind of like stalled. And so it was very interesting. But as you said, Derek Walcott participated, and he was very skeptical. He said, like, I come for one session and so, but like, I'm not really into this academic kind of debates. They're very artificial. And then he was the most vivid participant, and as I remember, invited us to his home, and all of us. And he was also fascinated from the discussion. So it was kind of like a newer discussion, but was very important to put it later together in a book. So it was not, we wanted to exclude people, but we wanted to have an open discussion that everybody feels they have the time, the openness, and can speak frankly, also about the complicatedness and also antagonism between the British Creole, the Anglophone Creole, the Francophone Creole, the Dutch Creole.
Yeah, that's like right. That's right.
Creole. To have a possibility to discuss this without being immediately under the watch. And then later, of course, the book is accessible until today for a public. So it's not an exclusive content. And also the talks at the moment are getting restored by Documenta to be put back on the website.
Yes, and that's going to be amazing when all of that is available. Because I always wanted to, I wished I could have been in Lagos to, attend that session and the one in Vienna. But now
they were available for about 10 years.
Not online. No, you mean online?
Online, yes.
Oh my goodness, I didn't realize.
But then, because of the change of copyright laws, they would have had to ask every participant, and then they took the page down. And now we insisted that as much as they can find estates in some cases, or like
Well,
the
getting
speakers
copyright,
to
yeah,
getting the copyrights renewed.
it's very onerous. That's a very difficult and time-consuming process, getting copyright permission for everything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
also find the addresses of everybody, because people do move in 20 years.
that's true too. Yes, yes. But today now, 21 years later, 20 years since Documenta 11, how do we assess Okwi's impact? You know, how do we gauge or measure his success? And of course, we should not measure his success only by looking at Documenta 11. He also curated a number of other groundbreaking exhibitions.
Yeah, certainly. What is interesting that Okwui hasn't been trained as a curator, and okay, that isn't too surprising. I'm not trained as a curator either, because curatorial education is fairly recent. But he has a background in political science, and he has been a poet. But already then he was publishing an art magazine, Inca, and about African art. And this, coming from political science, coming more also from the written form, he discovered the space of the curatorial as a space that can bring more complex sources together. And for me, beside of, I couldn't see the Johannesburg Biennale, but for me, a very important and until today, very influential exhibition is the Short Century African Independence Movement, where he brought together footage, news clips, news footage, television, but also entertaining popular music like Fela Kuti, books, literature, like so.
Architecture, all kinds of things. I mean, I was lucky enough to see that exhibition in New York when it took place there. It had a lasting impact on me, you know?
It was stunningly commissioned in Germany, in Munich, by Joanne Hansker for the Villa Stuck. This is why Okwui always said Germany gave me the chances that made me to, in the curatorial world, to this recognized figure. And so he was also very happy when he became the director, and very glad of Haus der Kunst in Munich. He was very proud to be entrusted with an influential institution. And of course, we could be very lucky in Germany that we had somebody who brought this level of complexity and I would say worldliness to German institutions. And you asked before, like, what is this legacy, or what is this deeper impact of Documenta? I think it's important to say that Okwui deterritorialized, as you heard from the Créolité platform, which was the third platform of Documenta. He started already in 2001 in March. We began at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, where I was professor at the time, with Democracy Unrealized, and Stuart Hall, I mean, an important person to both of us, you and I.
That's right.
Gave the keynote. He inaugurated basically Documenta with democracy at the horizon as something that never is reached. One always tries to come closer, but the horizon is always moving. And so it means basically democracy is ongoing process. You never reach it. You always have to attempt to reach it. And we saw this in recent years in the United States with Trump, like, which is seen America seen as kind of like a beacon of democracy. But we see democracy bordering around the globe, and the shift to the right and neo-nationalisms. And so I think this notion to bring specific discourses, democracy unrealized, in two parts, in Vienna and then in Berlin, in the House of World Culture, then in New Delhi, in the Habitat Center, experiments with truth, processes of reconciliation and transition, and then also Créolité, Creolization, and last but not least, Under Siege for African cities. It was Kinshasa, Lagos, Freetown, and Johannesburg. And so this kind of discourses that shaped also Okwi's thinking.
Right.
Wanted to
right.
have them as equal kind of like platforms than the exhibition. So the exhibition did take place in Kassel, but Documenta 11 is all of these 5 platforms.
It was dispersed,
equally.
yes. And talking about shifting goalposts leads me to the next question I had. In a previous conversation, you dropped this tantalizing bit of information about how, we know how ambitious Okwui was, but that the next horizon he would have liked to conquer would have been beyond art, would have been entertainment, you said. And can you talk about that a little more?
I think that was right in the aftermath of Documenta. I was also discussing with him, probably many people, but okay, what's next? I mean, Documenta is such a big thing. Of course, later he curated the Venice Biennale, All the World's Futures, and then this big 10-year project, almost one would say, that he could not fulfill, that he started with post-war at the Haus der Kunst, which was supposed to be followed by post-colonialism and then post-communism. But right after Documenta, he said he wants to become a film producer.
Okay.
He was really impressed, I think, also when he saw also Steve McQueen making this leap. Shifting really to, I mean, in the beginning, it wasn't the Oscar, that was much prior to 12 Years a Slave. It was earlier when he did Hunger and other films, like he basically started to go into feature filmmaking. And Isaac Julien, and Isaac was actually known before as a filmmaker and worked for BBC, Channel 4, like BFI featured his films. He was in Cannes. So I think there was a fascination for Okwui to really reach a wider audience. We always thought like he should become a politician. So so we had discussions where he might be very useful, but I think what Okwui showed us that art politics with other means, that the sphere of the artistic maybe lets us say a deeper truth, like not the daily truth, not the everyday history, but this long-term history that inscribes itself in a different way into kind of a global history and an understanding of the world. And I think he really returned in this respect to this big project, as I just said, like the post-war, and what does it mean? And he included in the post-war not only Europe, North America, etc. He included kind of the globe.
Right.
What was this impact? And then, of course, then the next position would have been post-colonialism, which will happen in parts, but of course it cannot happen the way Okwui would have done it at the Sharjah Biennale. Coming Sharjah Biennale number 15, for which he initially was invited as the curator, the 30th anniversary of this Biennale. Again, the Biennale more of the South. And then, of course, post-communism also links to his Venice Biennale, All the World Futures, where he addressed also, and again, Isaac and Mark would work on reading Capital.
Right. I remember.
He had always ambitious projects. And of course, you could imagine the Venice Biennale is not exactly where you want to read daily Karl Marx to the audience. But
that was a radical move, yes.
Yeah, and he's, he always believed in this. One should not underestimate the audience. It's good we are confronted. And that always sticked also to me. I mean, I care about the audience, but it's not like, oh, this is not digestible for an audience, or that's too complicated, or the audience will not get it. We never had this. We said, we have to learn it. We maybe don't get it either. It's work. And Stuart Hall always said, he said, like, to do all of this is work. It's work on ourselves. It's work on racism, to overcome racism. It's work. It's not just happening.
Right. And well, we're kind of reaching the end of our segment, but before we go, I really want to touch on something that I think is very important, which is that Okwui died very prematurely 2 years ago because he developed a vicious form of leukemia. So I want to talk about, the impact of all this superhuman work that he undertook on the frail body, how it takes its toll on people. And that's the timer going off, but we can talk about this and then wrap up. So how can we talk? And then also we're in this pandemic moment where health is uppermost on everyone's minds. I worry about you, Ute. I think sometimes that you are also pushing the margin a bit too much, and it has taken a toll on your health. Can we talk about how can we be more caring and less expose ourselves to stress a little less than we have been doing? You have been doing, I should say.
I mean, also my colleagues Sarat Maharaj and Octavio Saya, and so I think, and it's not just us in the art world, but I just think if like the work we do, and that is I would say it's not like that we don't think other people can do that work, but many people don't want to do the work.
Right.
So so it's and I think Okwui had a position, and he knew he had a special position in that what he did had resonance. So he wanted to achieve so much, like he really felt is a moment of opening, and it's also a lot needs to be done. He also was concerned about the future of his daughter. Like he always said, like, what will she be exposed to as a Black woman? And I think he would always work, like he never stopped. He always had multiple projects, and I think which you usually, when you're very healthy, you can do that. Mm-hmm. But I think the moment the body shows exhaustion or would need a break, I think we really have to be cautious, because as we see with Okwi's untimely passing,
absolutely,
nobody can do what he did, because he was himself, and it's not like, oh, somebody else can do it. No, it's not that people are just replaceable, and important voices, if they're gone, they're gone.
There you have it, Ute Meta Bauer. That segment was recorded about a week ago or a little longer, so there's some repetition with material that was discussed already with Isaac and Mark, and then you heard Ute's point of view, which is interesting. Is everyone back? Mark, Isaac?
Yes, we're back, and
we're here.
Thank you so much, Annie, for pre-recording that and showing it. And I think the ending really resonated with your last question about the fragility of the body in relationship to, in a way, the onerous task that Okwui set for himself, and to a certain extent others. And I think you're right that in this kind of time of fragility in relationship to questions of vulnerability to diseases, the pandemic, which we have all, in a way, labored in and have been affected by. I think it's, very important to think about this kind of Herculean task that Okwui had set for himself and the costs of that, perhaps, one could say.
That's
but I guess there was always this question of urgency, which was very paramount for Okwui in relationship to really trying to, in a way, do the work, the important work, which needs to be done in relationship to setting an agenda and trying to make those interventions which have a kind of impact, a long-lasting impact. And so I think that's, I think in a way, there was a certain synergy, you're right in your comment to Ute about being worried about her own sense of health and
her own, and also yours and Mark's, because I mean, just trying to prepare for this discussion, I had to be tracking you guys from LA to London to God knows where else, and trying to coordinate times when we could actually talk was quite difficult. So I think you all should pace yourself. And I know, I mean, what Ute says
I agree.
what Ute says is true, that, it's not that you consider yourselves indispensable, or irreplaceable, but this is work that only you can do, each of you. So you feel kind of driven to do it. But the pandemic reminds us that we do need to look after ourselves.
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely. And I think the question of locality becomes really important. And I think the local, as people call it, the globe local, if I pronounced it correctly, but there's a way in which I think our own habitat in relationship to the communities of interest that we're a part of become very important in terms of our thinking. At the same time, in England, I guess, because we've had this kind of inward thinking, which produced Brexit and produced a kind of, I would say, inversion of political discourse and a perversion really of the ways in which people might think about these questions of difference. It brings me to the kind of notion of one of the main points of the Creole platform, which was a question about Glisson's statement about that it's a question of the world becoming creolized. And I've been thinking about that and thinking about the resistance to that question of the world becoming creolized. And in effect, you could say, the pandemic has really, I think, emphasized that in the sense that, this is a disease that knows no boundaries, but I think the responses to it, when I try to also, suture them together with England's kind of inward lookingness, produces a kind of stagnation effect, which really is resisting this, it is a response to creolization, if you see what I mean,
Right. Yes, I do.
And I call it a kind of imperial implosion that's happening, this slow imperial implosion of what will become, Scottish independence and, Irish independence. And and it's a very interesting debate, Mark. You remember that debate, don't you? That Paul had with Glisson at the Black Atlantics conference.
That's right, yes. When they were discussing the concept of the archipelago and the opposition of the archipelago to the continent. And at one point, Paul said, well, England's a little island like the Caribbean, really. And Glisson said, no, England is a continent because England has the mass of its colonial history and its imperial history, which is still part of its psyche, as Isaac was saying. Glisson was very elegant and humorous, and I think Paul doesn't really agree with everything that Glisson says. But anyway, I think it was an interesting exchange.
But I think it's interesting as well, if you think about that question of, continental thinking and anapagelic thinking that Glisson was trying to, articulate. I think there's a way in which, we can see the destructive nature of the resistance to Creolization as well. But in fact, maybe the decolonizing impulse, has its after effect, So, Britain wanted to leave Europe, supposedly, but then of course Scotland wants to leave England, etc., etc. You see, and so you can't kind of, try to pretend that you can be independent, but then somebody else can't. And I think that's the kind of dilemma that we're in. And we can see these different spaces where the question of Creolization has been resisted. If we think about, Palestine and Israel, for example, and the terrible, terrible ramifications there at this moment in time. And, well, we can get into questions around, religion and its resistance to those very questions as well. But I think, yes, I think this question of the interventions that Okwui was making, I think you can see where the platforms and their discourses created a discursive frame for the ways in which he was framing artworks. And I'm also very sort of, in a sense, a bit ambivalent about the idea that, Okwui was, wasn't trained as a creator, wasn't a trained curator. I mean, I know that Mark was the director of the curatorial school at the Royal College, which is only a recent phenomena of training curators, which I think, and so, what is a curator, really? So I think, sorry, Mark, you was going to say.
Well, I was going to say two things. One was, we're happy to answer questions, but so far people are being a little reticent about using the chat function. So we're happy to pursue these lines of conversation. But I think the question of training and so on is complicated, because I think the role of the curator is historically determined. It's probably late 20th century, and maybe in another 20 years it may disappear. Artists may be much more proactive in organizing exhibitions. Other groups may, it's just a particular moment that people like Okwui, following on the footsteps of people like Harold Zeman, I suppose, were able to inhabit, and also to command the kind of budgets. One of the big things, people in the art world don't like talking about money very much. In fact, I was just writing an article about an artist, and the gallery said they wanted me to take out all the reference to the construction costs, because presumably it might queer the selling of the work. But the thing about Documenta was it had a big budget. It has even bigger budget today. And on that budget, it was possible to do research. And so it fitted Okwi's temperament that you could travel and read and research and do nothing else for a big period of time. I mean, academics in the UK have something called the Lever Hume, and there are similar schemes in other countries to buy. But this kind of curating, which I call in a way research-based curating, because it is based on developing arguments and researching them, rather than a kind of more responsive, intuitive, emotional curating, which is maybe less research-based.
Well, that's a very useful aside on curating and what it constitutes. I mean, nowadays you also have figures like Bonaventure Ndikang, whom we featured on one of the earlier global conversations. Have you come across him? He has no training in visual art. He comes from a physics background, but he's one of the hottest young curators now.
Yes, because in a way, I think in his project that he's been head of in Berlin over, I think, the last decade or so, he's been incredibly involved in a kind of visual research where, I mean, he's made several exhibitions. So I think this question around curatorialship and its orthodoxies in terms of how one would be trained, in a way very rigorously, I think, both should I say, contested by someone like Okwui and replaced with a set of practices which in a way were far more rigorous than those just merely to do with taste. Although it must be said that, that later on in, Okwi's life, he was incredibly interested in painting.
Was he?
And, oh yes, and I think if you think about the show, for example, of Frank Bolin at House de Contes, and the impact that made in relationship to the recognition of the contribution of a Caribbean artist such as Frank Bolin had made. Of course, an exhibition which preceded Tate's own show by a couple of years. I did say to the Tate curator of Frank Bolin's show, well, of course, your show is very nice because you were able to cherry pick after all that kind of curatorial research had been done by someone like Okwui Enwezor and others. So I think it's really interesting and was a great honor to be able to go to see that show and also to recognize that Frank Bolin, who's now Sir Frank Bolin, that I do think Okwui played quite an important part in the re-evaluation of Bolin's work. And that, I think, in a way, was perhaps the lasting or important legacy project that Okwui made in relationship to his interests in the Caribbean.
Yes, no, I'm so glad you remembered to bring that up, that exhibition. And also there was a conference that he held at the Haus der Kunst, at which there were people like Michael Dash and David Scott and others. Yeah. So you know what? We've reached the end of our time together. Is there anything you or Mark, Isaac, you or Mark would like to say as a final kind of word?
Well, from our point of view, Annie, it would be great to hear just a little bit about what your next project is.
Oh my goodness. Now that's such an unexpected question. Well, my ongoing project has been, and were you thinking of anything in particular, Mark?
Well, I mean, when we came before, you were very involved in Small Acts, which has circulated in London with people like Stuart and Paul reading it. And you were also part of that group when you came to St. Lucia.
Right.
And in a way, I was also asking the question, I suppose, of does Okwui continue to inform your practice in a way?
Yes, very much so, very much so. And both Stuart and Okwui inform what I do all the time. And the only thing I'd love to talk about briefly is the platform of writing that I mentioned earlier, which is called Pre. And it's you can see it at prelit.com, preelit.com. We come out it puts out 2 issues a year, and it's an online platform. We usually we select a theme and invite people to send us material, but in the process we've uncovered quite a few new voices in Caribbean writing, which I'm very proud of, and this is something that both Okwui and Stuart were into publishing, right? I mean,
Definitely.
The importance of publishing as a political act almost. So yes, that's the only thing I'd like to talk about or mention.
Thank
you. That's fantastic.
That's great. No, we'll
Thank
He was
definitely
always
have a look.
he was into doing big publications, as you know.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we're all the richer for it. Thank you so much, Isaac. And thank you, Mark, both of you for joining me. I mean, it's great to finally, I've known both of you for more than 20 years. And this is the first time we've actually done something together. So let's hope it's the beginning of other, a series of
Absolutely.
things, right?
Absolutely.
We'll be knocking on your door very soon, Annie.
We will be.
Yes. Yeah.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Thanks and bye-bye. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sorry there were no questions or comments, but it gave us more time to elaborate on the subject of this discussion. Thanks and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.